Welcome to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol, and I'm joined today by my friend Paul Cantor, professor of English at the University of Virginia, a frequent converser on Conversations about Shakespeare, about which you've written books, important books, and popular culture, about which you've written important books. Paul is also, I should say, the editor or curator, depending on which term you want, of the invaluable website on Shakespeare and politics. You can find it by just Googling Shakespeare and politics. It shows up, right? But also, or go to thegreatthinkers.org, thegreatthinkers.org, and you'll see various great thinkers, one of whom is Shakespeare, maybe the greatest. Do you think?
No.
Okay, we're sticking on the philosophy.
But he's the best.
We're sticking with Plato. We're sticking with Plato.
He's the best playwright on the list. I'll guarantee that.
I'm sure that seems like a good bet, right? Anyway, thank you for joining me today. And the genesis of this conversation was an article in The Atlantic a few months ago that we emailed about, claiming that maybe Shakespeare was a woman, and I was a little just astonished that this was kind of what I took to be some old kind of Shakespeare's not Shakespeare trope that was turned out to have a life today, and you actually knew a lot about it and have done further research. So, well, was Shakespeare Shakespeare? Let's begin with that.
Yes, Shakespeare was Shakespeare. I've looked at pictures of Francis Bacon, and I've looked at pictures of the Earl of Oxford. They don't look a thing like Shakespeare.
That's good.
So they can't have written those plays. Come on now.
Okay, so why does everyone want to, what's with the whole, I think this is kind of unusual. I mean, if you think about it in the history of literature or philosophy or art,
Yes,
this whole cottage industry, which has gone on for quite a long time now with different iterations, which we'll get to, of other people must have been Shakespeare. So what's going on?
Yeah, I can't frankly understand it, but let's begin with this example just to cite a few things here. The author of the article is Elizabeth Winkler, and it does appear in the June 2019 issue of The Atlantic, and it's titled, Was Shakespeare a Woman? And she chooses a woman named Emilia Bassano, who is actually reasonably well known in Shakespeare scholarship. A man named A.L. Rouse identified her as the infamous Dark Lady in Shakespeare's sonnets. She was of Italian descent in a family of musicians who lived in Elizabethan England and are fairly well known. And so she wrote poetry, but suddenly Elizabeth Winkler decided that she wrote Shakespeare's plays. And it's a very confessional piece. She begins with the fact that she's been to a lot of Shakespeare plays, and she's very impressed with the female characters. And they're presented sympathetically, they're often presented heroically, and they show great insight into the female character. And so,
all of which I think is true.
All of that is
the
very,
female characters are often much superior to their male counterparts in the comedies,
especially
right?
in the comedies. Yeah. And I've seen the formulation that for Shakespeare, tragedy is where men rule the world, and comedy is where women rule the world. And there's a certain truth to that. But from this, Winkler concludes that the person who wrote the plays had to be a woman. Now, that seems to me very fallacious reasoning from the start, because Shakespeare also portrays men sympathetically, and he portrays men as very interesting and deep, complex characters. So why shouldn't a man have written it? And it does strike me as an extreme example of the obsession with identity in contemporary literary criticism, that the first thing you have to find out about an author is the author male, female, lower class, upper class, black, white. Everything turns on the issue of the identity, and all literature is simply the expression of identity. I don't think that was Shakespeare's view. In fact, it's been a traditional view of Shakespeare that the miracle in Shakespeare is his ability to suppress his identity and get himself into all sorts of different characters. The great poet John Keats, who understood Shakespeare very well and was able to imitate Shakespeare's style in ways that very few people have been able to, he spoke of Shakespeare as the chameleon poet. And by that he meant he could just adapt himself to any identity. And above all...
That was praise, of course.
Yes, that was
Unlike
praise.
being a chameleon in politics. Or
Yes,
something,
yes,
right?
yes. But the great line in Keats was he could imagine an Imogen as well as an Iago. Now, we all know Iago, the great villain of Othello. Imogen is the heroine in the play Cymbeline, and is a truly innocent and wonderful young woman. And you see the point. He can imagine an Imogen as well as an Iago. That's precisely the point that Winkler and many of the anti-Shakespeareans deny. They're really denying the fundamental fact of the human imagination, that the real ability of a great dramatist, and especially Shakespeare, is to get out of his own identity in a way to suppress his identity. Jorge Luis Borges wrote an essay about this in which he said that Shakespeare is everything and nothing, meaning that he could well have been a cipher as a human being, a very ordinary human being, and yet what he had was the ability to imagine himself into a range of identities. And that's actually what upsets me about this approach to Shakespeare. It denies his imaginative ability and really denies the power of the imagination itself. And it often gets quite literal. I want to be able to cite a few things here to show I'm not making this up. But here's part of Winkler's argument about Shakespeare. Yet he left behind not a single book, though the plays draw on hundreds of texts, including some in Italian and French, that hadn't yet been translated to English. Nor did he leave any musical instruments, though the plays use at least 300 musical terms and refer to 26 instruments. This is bizarre reasoning. For Shakespeare to mention 26 musical instruments, he had to own each one of them, and moreover, detail them in his will. In fact, scholars who've looked into Elizabethan inheritance law have shown that typically wills did not list objects. There were separate inventories. But really, Shakespeare had to own each instrument. He wrote about it and will it specifically to his heirs. On the matter of books, it's very complicated, and we'll come back to it, but it has been shown that Shakespeare's son-in-law, in the very same house that he inherited from Shakespeare, in the inventory of that house, there are books. So where did they come from? We don't know. But the fact is, we don't know that Shakespeare didn't own any books simply because they're not listed in his will. I own thousands upon thousands of books, some of which I have with me here, and they're not listed in my will. I'm going to dispose of them differently. So this is what I object to, but I have to say this is what makes this kind of thing persuasive, that someone reading this would say, oh yeah, where are all the books and where are the musical instruments? Now, I don't want to go through the article line by line, but I do want to get to the key point for me where she says, I was stunned to realize that The Winter's Tale, Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, was likely completed 1611, was the same year Bassano published a book of poetry, Salve Deus Rex Judorum, Hail God, the King of the Jews. Her writing style bears no obvious resemblance to Shakespeare's in his plays, though one critic strains to suggest similarities. The overlap lies in the feminist content. Now, this to me is the weakest point in all these arguments, the stylistic point. Here we have poetry by Emilia Bassano, and it turns out it sounds nothing like Shakespeare. Now, we're going to come back to this maybe when we get to the Earl of Oxford, but at least in the case of Earl of Oxford, his poetry dates from very early in his life, and people are able to dismiss it as juvenilia and say, even though this doesn't sound like Shakespeare, he had years to develop the style that is distinctively his. But here, Winkler is insisting on the fact that, wow, Shakespeare published something, finished a play in 1611, and Bassano published a book of poetry at that time. Now, I'm just going to read one brief passage from her poem and then read something from The Winter's Tale. The poem is about the Passion of Christ. It's a very religious poem, and I've chosen randomly, basically, a passage about Adam and Eve. This will show you the feminist content of the work because it's arguing that Adam was more at fault in the fall of man than Eve was. But surely Adam cannot be excused, her fault, Eve's, though great, yet he was most to blame. What weakness offered strength might have refused. Being lord of all, the greater was his shame. Although the serpent's craft had her abused, God's holy word ought all his action frame. For he was lord and king of all the earth, before poor Eve had either life or breath. Who being framed by God's eternal hand, the perfectest man that ever breathed on earth, and from God's mouth received that straight command, the breach whereof he knew was present death, yea, having power to rule both sea and land, yet with one apple one to lose that breath, which God hath breathed in his beauty's face, bring us all in danger and disgrace. Now that's very bad poetry, and very unlike what Shakespeare was writing at the time. It's the kind of poetry you get from people who think poetry is what rhymes. Right. And you will notice this all the time to this day, that people think a poem has to rhyme, and more to the point, if it rhymes, it's got to be poetry. This is very conventional. It's end-stopped, as we say in my profession. That is, the lines heavily end with the rhyme words. Many of the rhymes are off, like earth and breath. I don't think you'd find that kind of off-rhyme in Shakespeare. And I'll just read a passage from The Winter's Tale. Again, this is supposed to convince us that Bassano wrote Shakespeare's plays. This is early in the play when a character, Leontes, has gotten jealous that a friend has seduced his wife. Gone already? Inch thick, knee deep, or head and ears a forked one? Go play, boy. This is talking to his child, who he now thinks is illegitimate. Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays, and I play too, but not so disgraced a part whose issue will hiss me to my grave. Contempt and clamor will be my knell. Go play, boy, play. There have been, or I am much deceived, cuckolds ere now, and many a man there is, even at this present. Now, while I speak this, holds his wife by the arm, that little thinks she has been sluiced in his absence, and is pond fished by his next neighbor, by Sir Smile his neighbor. Nay, there's comfort in it, while others men have gates, and those gates are open as mine. Now, this is dramatic, no end-stop lines, no rhyme. I mean, if you knew that Emilia Bassano knew independently that she had written Shakespeare's plays, you might desperately try to reconcile that poem with this play. But if you're talking about evidence that she wrote the plays, you have to have something stronger than that. And indeed, it's amazing that she says the content is the same, but the style is different. Well, style is what individuates authors, not content. Two different authors can say roughly the same thing, but in different styles. If we had handwriting here, something in Shakespeare's handwriting and something in Bassano's handwriting, that's what we would use to determine who wrote what, because handwriting is individual and specific to a certain person, whereas, again, content can be general. They can be saying the same thing, but in different styles. So I find it really quite incredible that she allows that point in her own article, and to me that undermines the whole thing right there. And it shows how much we've lost sight of the style of poetry and, quite frankly, the quality.
For me, that's what's striking, that similar content, as if, I mean, obviously anyone could have a feminist thought, and almost every serious thinker has at some point or other, from Plato on or before Plato. But the idea that you then dismiss, well, the style is somewhat different, but isn't
Yeah, the style
quality
is what differentiates authors, and it shows what has happened here in a lot of contemporary literary criticism, that identity trumps every other aspect of literature, that what you're really looking for is what is the identity of the author, and is he or she able to express it, as if that's what literature, poetry, drama is about. And I do think this essay reflects a dilemma in contemporary criticism. By the way, it attracted a lot of criticism, and it even the Atlantic was forced to rewrite the headline of the issue because of some of the criticism of it. But English studies have backed themselves into a corner at this point. So much has been devoted in the past few decades to showing the prejudices, the limitations of authors, the whole obsession with dead white males, the ideas, how can we remain in thrall to these authors who come from an earlier period and do not share our contemporary enlightenment. I think it's one reason the humanities in general are in danger in colleges and universities today. In particular, English departments are suffering large drops in enrollment. We as English professors used to champion the works we taught. That was our point, to show people how great the literature of the past is and how it could open their eyes to whole different worlds. And increasingly, the way literature is taught, we're just learning that Shakespeare was a creature of the patriarchy, as you would see in a play, let's say like Taming of the Shrew, that he was racist in his portrayal of Othello, that he was anti-Semitic in his portrayal of Shylock. And there are some truths to this approach, and you can see some ways in which Shakespeare was bound by the views of his time, but that really doesn't make the literature very welcoming to students, and I think they've turned away from that. So there has been a counter movement in literary studies, a desperate attempt to find that Shakespeare was a minority of some sort. To shift gears a bit, but this I think illustrates the point, there's been an increasing movement to claim that Shakespeare was a Catholic.
Yeah, I've been struck by that. That seems to have slightly different champions from the
yes, although some of the
Shakespeare as a woman thing.
Yeah, well, but I'll show you the relation. Now, there are arguments on both sides here. Really the question is, was Shakespeare what's technically known as a recusant, someone living under the Protestant regime of Queen Elizabeth who remained loyal to the old Catholicism? And remember, England had gone Protestant under Henry VIII. It had gone back to Catholicism under Queen Mary, and now back again to Protestantism under Queen Elizabeth. And certainly it was confusing to people at the time, and there's plenty of evidence that there were people who secretly maintained their Catholic faith, and in some cases not that secretly. And I can understand why Catholics would like Shakespeare to be Catholic. In general, people want Shakespeare to agree with them. Right. And it's almost as if they feel this will legitimate whatever their beliefs are. And quite frankly, I think Shakespeare's greatest ability is to represent the world and represent it accurately. And it does allow for people to react to Shakespeare the way they react to the world. Shakespeare gives a very accurate portrayal of the political world. If you're right-wing, you're going to find right-wing thoughts in Shakespeare. If you're left-wing, you'll find left-wing thoughts. I take great credit. I'm a libertarian, and I've never thought that Shakespeare was a libertarian. I'm willing to
further research will allow you to discover this.
No, I've shown that Ben Jonson's play Bartholomew Fair is a libertarian play with deep associations with Friedrich Hayek. So I've done my bit there. But Shakespeare, I've just read him, and I don't think he was
Measure
a
for
libertarian.
measure, no. There's a little bit of libertarianism there.
Yes,
right?
I believe he had an aristocratic worldview. Anyway, but I'd just like to say I'm an exception in that respect, that everyone feels they've got to get Shakespeare on their side. So again, I think it's understandable that Catholics have argued that Shakespeare was Catholic. By the way, I think an honest reading of his plays shows that he was anti-Catholic in the terms of his day, that he wanted religion taken out of politics, and you can see it in his history plays, you can see it in Measure for Measure, that he thought having a Catholic politics would be disastrous. Anyway, that's a subject for another conversation. But in any case, what surprised me is when non-Catholic critics started arguing for Shakespeare as Catholic, and this would include Stephen Greenblatt and a whole set of critics, many of whom are Jewish and have no Catholic axe to grind. And I was actually a little puzzled by it. I was reviewing Michael Wood's, I think it's called In Search of Shakespeare, when I first realized, aha, now we can say he's a minority. He's an oppressed minority as a Catholic under the oppressive Elizabethan regime. And increasingly critics present Elizabeth's regime as oppressive, and there's a great deal of truth to that. But the idea, it's bad enough that Shakespeare's a dead white male, but he's a WASP. He's a white Anglo-Saxon
who
Protestant.
got along with the regime,
with the establishment,
that
he was a creature of the establishment
at the time.
Yeah, his plays performed at court and so on. And so if he could be a Catholic, then you could have him in a minority position. He's persecuted. He's speaking truth to power. And I do think he was, but not for this reason. By the way, I do not think he was at all a creature of the establishment. I, for example, have argued that he was a Republican. Small r. That he was, his plays about Rome were an attempt to revive the idea of Roman republicanism and to modify the British monarchy in the direction of the mixed regime of the Roman Republic. And I think he actually succeeded in that task. But anyway, just to show I'm not taking a conventional view of Shakespeare myself, but here you have the idea, if Shakespeare's a Catholic, then we can start invoking all our methods of reading people who are outside the mainstream and battling persecution and championing a minority cause. And so the other side of that would be here to say that these plays were written by a woman. Now, it's a kind of fantasy. Again, what troubled me and a lot of other people about this article is that the evidence is very weak in it. And Winkler more or less admits, I'm sitting there in a play and I'm thinking it's really giving good portrayals of women. Oh, a woman must have written these plays. And that, it's just, I wish this was true, so it is true. And it's another illustration of how postmodernism has corrupted our world, that this postmodern claim that there is no truth with a capital T has now opened us up to all sorts of fake news. And it is now fake news in the academic world. It's clear The Atlantic published this because they thought it would sell copies and get interest, and it did. And again, it would be the idea, well, we got attention. Who cares if it's mainly negative attention? Our name is in the news. And that, by the way, is what stokes this whole movement and keeps it alive almost 2 centuries at this point, that it's not news that Shakespeare wrote his plays. We all know that. But it is news if Francis Bacon wrote them, or the Earl of Oxford, or Emilia Bassano.
Well, let's go back maybe then to the beginning of this movement. But there's this sort of postmodern, you might say, attempt to say Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare, maybe couldn't have been Shakespeare. But the earlier movement, I mean, it's not coming out of nowhere. So there's a long history of this Shakespeare denial or whatever you want to call it.
Although it's not as long as some people think. In the Atlantic's original subheader was, the authorship controversy, almost as old as the works themselves, has yet to surface a compelling alternative to the man buried in Stratford. Well, as people quickly pointed out, the authorship controversy is not as old as the plays themselves. Shakespeare was controversial in his day, and there were arguments whether he was stealing from other authors and so on, but no one at the time doubted that Shakespeare wrote the plays. So if you go online now to which Shakespeare woman, what you read is the authorship controversy has yet to surface a compelling alternative.
So they took out the
so this is the problem in the world of the internet. The history just gets rewritten here, and it's an interesting case that did happen. Anyway, to give credit where credit is due, the first person to question seriously that Shakespeare wrote his plays was named James Wilmot, and this was in 1785.
Is that right? That late?
Yeah.
So basically in the 17th century, all these 17th century critics and poets, and 18th century, of which there were a ton, appreciators of Shakespeare, had no issue. I mean, it was just, that was Shakespeare, and they discussed the plays, and there was none of this.
There's a false idea that there are only a few references to Shakespeare in his time. There are dozens upon dozens of references, people writing poems as tributes to him, people referring to him as the author of the plays and as a great poet. We talked in one of our preceding conversations about Sir Francis Mears and his Palladis Tamia, where he lists the great playwrights of his day and presents Shakespeare as the greatest of them. And
shortly after, I mean, I don't know much about this, but in the 17th and early 18th century, it's taken for granted that he's a very great figure, right? It's not like he's obscure. It's not one of these, not like Mozart or something who's forgotten for decades or a century.
He got eclipsed by his sidekick John Fletcher after Fletcher replaced him as the main playwright for the Kingsmen. But as soon as plays were revived in 1660 with the Restoration, his plays were revived. And in the 18th century, he emerged.
He's the bard, right?
Without
you see this, even in the Federalist Papers, there's a quote in Federalist too, and I think it's if we may quote the bard, they don't even mention Shakespeare's name, as I recall.
Now, the best book on this controversy is by James Shapiro, and it's called Contested Will, who wrote Shakespeare. Great title,
Good title,
Contested Will. I wish I could come up with titles like that. But he points out it was only when Shakespeare became idolized and indeed turned into a god that heretics became possible. And it's a very interesting way of looking at it, let's say people could live with the thought that this guy from Stratford was a very good playwright, but once you claimed he was a god, and that's the language used by the late 18th century, you encourage people to think, well, this can't have been so great, at least not some country bumpkin from Warwickshire. Can't be so great, and so it encouraged people to start.
So the line of attack is less, he's not a god, the plays are all flawed, but rather, I guess that would be one possible line of attack. The other possible line of attack is he didn't write them, right?
Right, exactly, and that's when you start to get these arguments that, again, Francis Bacon was the first alternative proposed, and I have here, just to thrill you in the audience, this is a first edition of the first book ever to question that Shakespeare wrote his plays. It's called The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded by Delia Bacon. Now, no relation to Frances, but towards the end of her life, she started to think she was. This extremely valuable book, which I purchased for $5 in a used bookstore.
You can email us if you're interested in making a really outlandish offer for this book. Right?
Indeed, it's in pretty good condition. No markings, and this.
So when does she write this?
1857.
Oh, that late.
So it is. I brought it to show that this whole controversy really is quite late. There were various comments and theories going around, but the first serious book, the first serious challenge to Shakespeare's authorship was 1857. So recent, I own a copy of the first printing of it, and I just had it authenticated by a bibliographer that it is the first printing. Now, it's actually a pretty remarkable book, and for example, Nathaniel Hawthorne not only wrote a preface for it, but he paid for its printing in England. He was so impressed with her, though he's rather cagey in the preface in not revealing, not saying that he agrees with her. Now, this book is talked about but very seldom read. In fact, I read one comment on it and said that no one has ever read it, and I have to confess there may be some truth to that. It's perhaps the most unreadable book I've ever seen. It's 700 pages long in very small print. I've now read about 300 pages of it, and not consecutively, because I read like the first 100 pages, the last 100 pages, and a middle 100 pages. It's one of the strangest books ever written. She writes very well, though her sentences are infinitely long. Her prose is overheated. She's making titanic claims on every other page about changing the world. I'm going to try to state her thesis, but it's very hard because she never does. It's very hard to understand how weird this book is. She almost never...
But it gives birth to a whole
yes,
series
yes.
of things.
She almost never names names. Everything is periphrasis. She'll be talking about the only man in England who is great enough to have comprehended a subject of such depth. Now, she should say Francis Bacon, but she won't. You can read for pages and not be sure who she's talking about. But as far as I can gather her thesis, it is that the Elizabethan era was one of great repression, that Elizabeth ruled as a tyrant, and the writers at the time, reacting to this absolutism of the Tudor regime, could not speak openly, and therefore they had to find coded ways to write. In fact, she talks openly about esoteric writing. She's like the Leo Strauss of the 19th century. And it's quite remarkable. I don't have time to read passages, but there are extended passages about the nature of esoteric writing, that in an era of persecution, authors have to learn to write secretly. And she believes that Shakespeare's plays are the esoteric expression of Bacon's philosophy. But this is all in conjunction with Sir Walter Raleigh as well. She's a real conspiracy theorist. She believes that the men who opposed Elizabeth's regime and wanted to end Tudor absolutism were working secretly to subvert the regime. She chooses Walter Raleigh as her first example and discusses him at great length, but then she sees Raleigh in league with Bacon, and she brings in the great poet Edmund Spenser. She actually mentions the Earl of Oxford. She claims there was this conspiracy of philosophical opponents of Elizabethan tyranny who wrote works like Bacon's Novum Organum and the Advancement of Learning, but settled upon plays to be the means of getting this message out to the audience, and that's where we get Shakespeare's plays. Now, she's again, there's remarkable passages where she uses the word esoteric of writing, and she has read Bacon very carefully, particularly the Advancement of Learning. I've written about the Advancement of Learning, and so I know she's quoting the right passages. I know that because they're the same passages I quote in my essay on Francis Bacon. she knew Morse, of Morse code fame, and so she was alive to the notion of ciphers, of coding, and so she came upon 20 pages in the advanced learning that discuss codes. And they are really remarkable. They are tucked away in the middle of the book, and yet they're the key. I'm saying this now. They are the key to the whole book. Bacon's discussion of secret codes is a discussion of esoteric writing.
Right.
And it's just an amazing example of esoteric writing. He seems to be talking about something as trivial as cryptograms, but he's really telling you how to write esoterically, and she understands that. And she works out. Bacon had something called the bilateral cipher. I can actually explain it, but we don't have 20 minutes. But she understands the bilateral cipher, and she thinks it's at work in Shakespeare's.
I mean, they did use a lot of ciphers and codes
Yes,
in
they
diplomatic
did. Yes,
correspondence, right?
and
It wasn't ridiculous.
And you had Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth Spymaster, who was charged with tracking down these codes and breaking them. So there's an awful lot of truth in this book, and she writes at length about King Lear, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus. Coriolanus, which is my personal favorite among Shakespeare's plays, and I've written 2 books about it. She devotes more time to Coriolanus in this book.
She's kind of the Paul Cantor of the 19th century. Let's put it that way. You
Okay,
know?
yeah, all right. That I'm legendarily write clearly.
Yes,
and
you
she
do.
does. She does
Nor,
not.
and you don't write 850-page books.
Yeah, it is. It's so strange that I keep waiting for her to say what a play is about, and she never does. She hints at stuff, and the most frustrating thing about the book is she keeps saying she has another volume of historical studies that prove all this. And it's very possible she did, and no one would publish it.
Yeah, well.
But all the evidence is not in the book. It's in an unpublished book that we have no access
It's
to.
a good project for you for the next few years.
I wonder
Dig
where,
it down in some country manor in England. You know.
She is American, I'll say. She went over to England with the project of digging up Shakespeare's grave so that she could find the manuscripts of his plays, and she was not allowed to do it. And then she wanted to dig up Bacon's tomb to find the manuscripts. It's really, I've been hesitating to say it. She went insane 2 years after this book came out. It's actually a very sad story, and there are hints in this book that she's on her way. And in that sense, I don't want to impugn her writings. I'm saying much nicer things about her than almost anyone does.
Anyway, so she gets this whole thing going.
Yes.
And what is the thrust of the general arguments that then take over in the Shakespeare can't be? Why can't Shakespeare be Shakespeare according to these 19th century?
Okay.
types?
I should start with that. The basic argument turns on education. The idea is that we have no records of Shakespeare's education, and in fact, we don't have records of his non-education because the records of the grammar school in Stratford have been lost. We do know a lot about that grammar school, and Shakespeare probably went there because his father was virtually mayor of Stratford at one point, was a wealthy tradesman. He was a glover. He was in the glove trade. One thing we know is these students in Stratford were very well educated in Latin. People have said they probably came out of that high school knowing Latin better than most classics majors colleges today. One thing they did, for example, again, we have records what the curriculum was. They were reading Virgil, they were reading Ovid. One thing they would have to do was translate a passage in Latin into English and then retranslate it into Latin without making reference to the original. That really teaches you Latin. Ben Jonson famously said of Shakespeare that he had small Latin and less Greek. But Ben Jonson was one of the great classical scholars of the age, so that means Shakespeare had a good deal of Latin and even knew Greek.
Right.
Probably knew New Testament Greek. But anyway, the argument is that he was uneducated and didn't go to college. Now, it turns out Ben Jonson didn't go to college. Ben Jonson, who was the son of a bricklayer, got into the Westminster School in London. We'd call it a magnet school now. It's the best school in London, and got a great education there, but never went to college. A few of the playwrights, like Christopher Marlowe, went to college, and the group of them were even called the University Wits, and it does seem that they made fun of Shakespeare when he first came to London for not having a college education. But so a lot of the argument is he didn't have a college education. He shows knowledge of foreign lands, such as Italy. His description of Venice is pretty accurate. He knows that business is done on the Rialto, and he knows what a gondola is. And and of course, he displays great knowledge of the aristocracy, and I'd say really deep knowledge, that he understands the aristocratic nature as well as Plato and Aristotle do, for example. And so that's why people think that this man from Stratford, as they refer to him, was not well educated enough to write these plays, and so that's when.
And also not from noble. It'd be better if he were from noble
yes,
origins, right?
Yes.
Too much of a commoner, kind of.
Yes, and there was now remember this is flourishing in the Victorian era, and so one thing you get is a late Puritan response to the vulgarity of the plays, all the dirty jokes and all the double entendres, and people wished that wasn't part of the plays. And so the argument would be that someone like Bacon wrote the plays and he arranged to have them staged, and Shakespeare was the front man, but being this vulgar country bumpkin, he added these dirty jokes to please the audience. And so, Shakespeare was highly Bowdlerized, expurgated in the 19th century.
When is Mr. Bowdler?
It's 19th century,
early
19th century
19th,
England, and
yeah.
so and there were all these efforts to rewrite Shakespeare, clean the stuff up, and so that was the thinking in the Victorian period, and in a weird way, this is all very middle class, though it's trying to conjure up an aristocratic Shakespeare. It's a kind of middle class fantasy of the aristocrat as well-bred, contrary to the nature of these Elizabethan aristocrats, who we'll see when we talk about the Earl of Oxford, were not exactly the most admirable people in the world. But just to focus on the issue of college education, it's such a bourgeois thing to think that you need a college education to write a great work of literature. Obviously, throughout most of literary history, the authors didn't have college educations. But even when they did, it was not what we think of as a college education. Oxford and Cambridge, during Shakespeare's lifetime and well before and well beyond, were basically there to train ministers. You had to know Latin to be able to read the Vulgate, the translation of the Bible. You had to know some Greek to be able to read the New Testament. And insofar as there was a curriculum at Oxford, it was a curriculum in the classics in that sense. But Shakespeare might well have been taught by an Oxford graduate in the Stratford Grammar School, and that's how we would have learned his Latin and Greek. But as to what else happened, they were basically social institutions. Now take Christopher Marlowe, who did go to Cambridge. But there's this strange fact about Christopher Marlowe that he didn't seem to spend much time at Cambridge, and indeed, when it came degree time, Cambridge refused to grant him his degree. And the Privy Council, Elizabeth's Privy Council, had to intervene to order Cambridge to give Marlowe his degree because he was on Her Majesty's service. And if you're thinking James Bond here, you are correct. No one knows for sure, but the theory is that Marlowe had traveled to the continent to spy on Catholic refugees, who were a problem for Elizabeth's regime, and he may have been mixing among these refugees to find out if any plots were going on against Elizabeth. That's the best theory of why he was absent from class. But it gives you some idea what kind of education was he getting, and you see that as well. I mean, just to jump ahead to the Earl of Oxford here is another reason people offer him.
So who's a big candidate in this world, right?
Besides Bacon, the other big candidate, the other two we'll discuss. But people, the Earl of Oxford enrolled at Cambridge when he was 8 years old. Now that seems prodigious to us. Now what an intellectual prodigy, and he must have had 1,600 SAT scores. Right. Well, it's just such an anachronistic view of what it meant to go to Oxford. It was there as like a finishing school for him. And here's the joke: there's no record of his ever getting a BA from Cambridge. He has MAs from Cambridge, honorary MAs from Cambridge and Oxford. And so this notion that he was this brilliant student who got this great education at Cambridge and Oxford, and you will see it quoted again and again that he had MAs from Oxford, Cambridge. Now let me ask you something. How hard do you think it would be for the Earl of Oxford to get an honorary degree from Oxford?
Plus, he's this big shot, right? I mean,
yes,
he's very
he was
important politically.
It was the second oldest aristocratic family in England, and if he hadn't screwed up his whole life, he would have been a close counselor of Queen Elizabeth. But you know what honorary degrees are like today. Yep. They are, here's your degree, write us a check. Right. I mean, even today you can observe a certain corruption in academic life that particularly honorary degrees are not necessarily a reflection of some kind of intellectual brilliance. So, I mean, we're told, Oxford must have written the place because he had MAs from Oxford and Cambridge. But, again, how much does it take for the Earl of Oxford to get a degree from Oxford?
But how much of this is about Bacon or Oxford? I guess in Delia Bacon's case, it's sort of about Bacon, and how much of it's about it can't be Shakespeare? He's this commoner.
Yes.
He's an actor.
Yes.
We'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, they don't like the idea of some guy who just comes from Stanford. Stanford.
That would be even worse.
That's terrible. It comes to London and just becomes partly a business, an owner, and partly a player in this.
Another, very interesting aspect to it is the anti-commercial spirit, which is so characteristic of Victorian England. The English class system that you see in Jane Austen, where you can't marry a man because he made his money by trade, and so a lot of it was the anti-commercial spirit. Now, starting in the late 18th century, there was a great effort to uncover biographical documents about Shakespeare. People wanted to know more about him. They were fascinated by him. They wanted to understand. So there was this great, we don't have any letters by him. We don't have a diary from him. Surely we can find something that shows he's real. Now the result, again, Shapiro shows this in his book, was forgeries. People started...
the market works, right?
The market works, yes. This guy, I think it's William Henry Ireland, forged a diary by Shakespeare, letters from Shakespeare to the Earl of Southampton and back, forged a manuscript of King Lear. We don't have his manuscripts. Well, Ireland found one. Eventually forged a play, Vortigern. He found a lost play by Shakespeare. Unfortunately, he staged it, and the audience broke out in laughter. It was so bad, and that was the end of that. But there was this desperate effort to find some signs of Shakespeare, and they found them. And what they found, that Shakespeare, in addition to be a successful commercial playwright, traded in real estate, he loaned money, and he was involved in the malt trade. That was a big business in Stratford. And he was actually accused of engrossing at one point. It gives you an idea of how mercantilist and pre-capitalist Shakespeare's England was. Shakespeare was caught hoarding grain because he thought the price was going to go up. In other words, just the way businessmen behave, normal function on the market. He was hoarding grain in case there'd be an emergency. And he'd make a lot of money, but he'd feed people when they didn't have food to eat. Anyway, good businessman, Will. But they just didn't find what they wanted. They wanted a love letter to Anne Hathaway. They wanted letters to his mistress, whoever she was. They wanted something to show what a sweet guy he was. And all they found were largely documents from law cases where he's suing some guy for failure to pay debts. And you know, it's pretty clear that he wanted to make money, and he was the most successful playwright of his day. By the way, one of the charges against him is there's not a single record of his being paid for a play. There's a guy named Philip Henslow. We discovered his diary. He was a theater manager, and we actually have these markings, £5 to William Rowley for additions to Dr. Faustus. And this is a wonderful document because we can see what people were paid and how they were brought in script doctors and so on. And there's no such record for Shakespeare. Well, there's a simple answer to that. Shakespeare was the big one. He was number one. He had, to put it in Hollywood terms, a percentage of the gross. In Hollywood terms, Shakespeare had points. So he was not paid the normal way for plays, given a fixed fee. He was a shareholder in what was first the Lord Chamberlain's Men and then the King's Men, part owner of the Globe Theatre and so on. And he didn't make his money from simple payments. He got a percentage of the profits.
And he was an actor too, right?
Yes, he was an actor.
So it's very much like...
A man of the theater. Now, here I just have, this is actually the greatest moment in my scholarly life, was a moment when Charlton Heston came to my rescue, and you'll understand this because it's something that happened in the Weekly Standard. I was reviewing one of these anti-Shakespeare books by Joe Sobrand called Alias Shakespeare, Solving the Greatest Literary Mystery of All Time. And I had some fun at Sobrand's expense in this essay. It's a long story, but basically I called him a Marxist. Joe Sobrand was a very conservative writer, and I knew I could get his goat by calling him a Marxist because he was claiming only an aristocrat could have written these plays, a commoner couldn't have written them, and that's a Marxist class conscience position. And I got some really nasty letters in response, one from Sobrand, one from someone else. But I was amazed when I opened up the May 19th, 1997 issue of the Weekly Standard, and Charlton Heston has written this long letter in my defense.
We were amazed to get it at the office. And this was I don't know if it came in this was very early email. This may have actually come in the mail, amazingly enough.
Yeah, and it's on Charlton Heston, Beverly Hills, California. But it's such a marvelous letter, and it's so intelligent and so cultured. I just want to read 2 paragraphs from it. Being a writer, Sobrand misreads Shakespeare as academics do. He treats him as a writer. I know, there he is on the page, but that's not where he or his plays live. Shakespeare leaps alive in air in the spoken sound of his words. Only actors really understand this, though audiences sense it subliminally in performance. When you're redacting the plays in rehearsal, you make the changes in terms of the sound as much as the meaning. That's what Shakespeare did as actor-manager. His plays loom so massively over all the other writing in the world because of his sublime gift, but it was a poet-player's gift. He created those men and women to live on a stage, seen in light and sudden dark, heard in cries and whispers. Exploring them there reveals more than a lifetime in a library can. And that's so eloquent, and it's so correct. The people have it all wrong. The claim was, how could an actor have written these plays? Well, an actor's an awfully good candidate for having written the plays because they show an actor's sense. And my theory would be Shakespeare's college education was the Globe Theater. Actually, it wasn't the Globe because it wasn't built till later. But Shakespeare lived at a time when apprenticeship was the real model of education. Let's take Leonardo da Vinci, a universal genius, the other candidate for greatest mind of the Renaissance. Came from a provincial town, curiously called Vinci, and came.
Where is that? Somewhere.
It's northeast of Florence. And he came to Florence. He didn't go to college.
Now, this is earlier than Shakespeare.
Yeah, it is. But here's another genius,
right?
One of the greatest painters of all time. And how did he study painting? He didn't go to the fine arts department of the University of Rome. He went to Verrocchio. And he learned painting in the studio of Verrocchio. There are some paintings where, Verrocchio painted part of it, Da Vinci painted the other part. And in general, when you go to the Italian Renaissance painters, they were all sons of middle-class businessmen, of artisans, frequently of goldsmiths. Again, Shakespeare was the son of a glovemaker. For that matter, Marlowe was the son of a shoemaker, and Ben Jonson was the son of a bricklayer. They all came out of these middle-class backgrounds of artisanship. And we now think of literature as a romantic self-expression. Again, now the idea of expression of identity. Shakespeare lived in a world of craftsmanship. Literature was craftsmanship. Painting was craftsmanship. Sculpture was craftsmanship. How did you learn to be a sculptor? Like Michelangelo, you went to a sculptor and learned the craft. So as far as we can see, Shakespeare came to London. He saw that the theater was the fast lane for success. He became an actor and worked his way up in this theater company, and all the time he was learning by doing. London at that time was the greatest school in drama in the world, and again, in some ways his dramas are not poetry, they are dramas, and his great skill is dramatic. It's in the constructing of plots. When you look at his earliest plays, Comedy of Errors, the Henry VI plays, they're already extremely dramatic. The poetry is not as good as in the later plays. It takes him a while to learn that. But he knows what's a dramatic scene, and that's because he was observing Thomas Kidd and Robert Greene and Christopher Marlowe. And that was the best way he could learn to do it, by apprenticing himself. And Shapiro brings up this point that's very relevant to the authorship question, namely the collaborative nature of plays in Shakespeare's day. The theories of Bacon or Oxford, they all assume that the way you write a play is go off into a study somewhere and write this perfect play in isolation.
The solitary artist.
The solitary artist who then hands it over to Shakespeare, who kind of makes it popular with a few dirty jokes and so on. Now, in recent decades, increasingly people have come to recognize the collaborative nature of Shakespeare's art. And here it's interesting. It's his earliest and his latest plays that are collaborative. The bulk of his career, he was unusual among Elizabethan Jacobean playwrights in that he could write great plays all by himself. Marlowe, for example, was a great tragic writer, but evidently not good at comedy, and we think that the theater companies brought in someone guy I mentioned, William Rawley, who wrote the comic scenes in Dr. Faustus, which do seem to be on a lower level than the tragic scenes. Shakespeare could write comedy and tragedy. He's actually very unusual in the history of drama in that respect, although one of his contemporaries, Thomas Middleton, was equally good at comedy and tragedy. But it does seem at the beginning of his career, Shakespeare had to work his way in. He couldn't show up and say, I'm William Shakespeare, the greatest playwright ever. He had to prove himself. So it does look that, for example, Titus Andronicus, many people now, in fact, most people think it's a collaboration with Robert Greene. Most recently, people were claiming that one of the parts, Henry VI, was written along with Marlowe. And these are based on stylistic grounds and other considerations. It does look like early in his career, he worked with other playwrights. Now, how does that fit the Earl of Oxford theory? How does it fit the Francis Bacon theory? The whole premise of those theories is that these guys were keeping themselves aloof. The theory is that an aristocrat would be ashamed to be writing for the commercial theater and therefore concealed his authorship by passing it off on Shakespeare. But how could he conceal his authorship if he was collaborating with another author? Now, similarly, at the end of his career, Shakespeare started some more collaborations. Pericles was written with a man named George Wilkins, who undoubtedly wrote the first two acts of the play. And above all, Shakespeare started working with John Fletcher, and he co-authored Henry VIII, Two Noble Kinsmen, and the lost play Cardenio. There is a lost play by Shakespeare. We have overwhelming records that he wrote a play called Cardenio with John Fletcher, and it was taken from Cervantes' Don Quixote. So we've lost.
It's terrible.
It's really a shame. But anyway,
it's like something from Borges or something.
Yes, indeed.
That it wouldn't actually really be a lost. It would be a sort of fake lost play.
Yeah, but it's very complicated. Some guy in the 18th century claimed to have a manuscript of it and rewrote it, and so we have a play called The Double Falsehood by Louis Tybalt, which claims to be an adaptation of it. In any case, what seems to be happening there is Shakespeare is training his successor and building up his reputation. One puzzle about William Shakespeare's life is he appears to stop writing around 1610, 1611, and he doesn't die till 1616. My own theory, and some people share this, is that he did deliberately retire from the stage in order to prepare a complete edition of his plays, and none of his plays were ever published with his supervision. It's a great problem with Shakespeare texts that he did not proofread them or even supervise them. I believe he decided he was going to prepare an edition. Unfortunately, died at the age of 52 before completing the task. I think when you look at the plays, several of them, The Tempest, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus, have such beautiful, near-perfect texts that I think Shakespeare had succeeded in preparing those. They were among the last plays he wrote, as if he was working back from what he'd written most recently. And again, unfortunately,
and those texts are published in the edition that comes out after his
in the
death.
folio. Yes, yeah,
folio.
Yeah. And by the way, another frequent argument is that Shakespeare's death went unrecognized in 1616, and it took 7 years for his friends to bring out the first folio. It would take editors 40 years today to bring out that edition. And it's clear it was recognition of his genius, that his friends, and by the way, there were 18 plays that we would not otherwise have if it weren't for the first folio.
Is that right? We don't have this.
The Cordos, yeah. No,
Wow.
we wouldn't have Julius Caesar, we wouldn't have Othello.
So his friends go to all the trouble of producing this, so to speak, authoritative
compilation of
plays.
and in which they did what looks to us primitive now, but some form of editing. And again, I think they had the papers, and I think Shakespeare had made arrangements with them. And a folio was an incredibly expensive volume. It would cost an ordinary person more than a year's wages to buy that folio. And in fact, fortunately, Ben Jonson had prepared a folio edition of his plays in 1616 and called them works, which shocked people because plays were not supposed to be works, opera. They were not supposed to be fancy literary works. They were the way we would regard a TV script now.
Oh, that's interesting.
And fortunately, Ben Jonson prepared the way for accepting the idea of a folio edition of Shakespeare's plays. So again, it shows you how narrow-minded and again, in a sense, anachronistic, this notion that there was no recognition of his death. The first folio is the great monument to Shakespeare, and it was presented as such in the first folio, and Ben Jonson wrote this great encomium to Shakespeare there. So anyway, this is what I keep saying, that people are reading Shakespeare as if he were a modern author. For example, there's a continuous complaint that he didn't leave the copyright of his works to his family in his will. There was no authorial copyright until well into the 18th century in England. There was publishing copyright. The publisher held the copyrights. And in Shakespeare's case, his theater company owned the plays. He worked for this theater company, again, as a stockholder in it. But that was the great thing. It meant to have Shakespeare writing for you, that you had the exclusive use of his plays. So he did not own any copyrights he could pass on. So we have all these theories that the person who wrote these plays can't have been a man of the theater. And that's so completely wrong that again and again what you see about Shakespeare is that he was a man of the theater. So that, for example, in this case of John Fletcher, Shakespeare's theater company decided to open up a private theater. They had been performing in the Globe since around 1599, 1600, but they got a chance to lease a theater called the Blackfriars. It was an indoor theater. Their plan was to cater to a smaller audience. I think the Blackfriars sat about 600 people, whereas the Globe could take 2,500 or 3,000. But they were going to charge 6 times as much for a ticket. And of course, they could perform in the winter since it was an indoors theater. If you want to see what it looked like in Stanton, Virginia, there's a marvelous replica of it, which has a local theater company that performed Shakespeare there, and you can see what it was like to perform in the Blackfriars. But it's very interesting that this was going to be a big move for theater. Now, they were going to continue to perform in the Globe during the summers, but still, this was a big deal, and there were all these signs that they prepared for it. And one of the things they did was they knew they needed new playwrights. A lot of the famous playwrights had died at this point. Shakespeare was getting old. And so they seemed to have lit upon this guy, John Fletcher. And they were right, because he eventually teamed up with a guy named Francis Beaumont, whom they also brought in. And Beaumont and Fletcher were the Gilbert and Sullivan of the 17th century. Their plays became more popular than Shakespeare's in the 1610s, 20s, 30s, and right up to the Puritans shutting down the theater. And at the time of the Restoration in 1660, Shakespeare's plays were revived, but Beaumont and Fletcher's plays were revived. So Shakespeare and his company knew something. They knew that this was the next Shakespeare. Now, in larger terms, he was not. But he was a very successful player, again, especially after he teamed up with Francis Beaumont. And they hit upon a new kind of play that aristocratic audiences would like. They're called tragicomedies. They're stories that have all this tragic material, but they have a turn towards a comic ending.
Something Shakespeare anticipated, though. I mean,
well, yes, and
Shakespeare's comedies are often that way.
Yes,
right?
And then he wrote a number of tragicomedies along with Fletcher, including Two Noble Kinsmen. And it does seem that Shakespeare changed his style, and it definitely changes his style. I read you a passage from Winter's Tale, which is a good example of a late Shakespeare play, a tragicomedy, and the style becomes incredibly Baroque, much harder to follow, and yet audiences evidently could follow. He changes his style, and he changes the very substance of his plays. He moves from tragedy to tragicomedy. And again, this is something that the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon would have known nothing about. It's something that grows out of the theater world itself, where Shakespeare's anticipating trends, working with the youngest playwrights to keep the King's Men going. And again, by the way, he shows knowledge of the individual actors who are in his company. And there's a marvelous touch, that Shapiro points out, that in some of Shakespeare's plays, as they're published in his day, in these quartos, he sometimes puts the actor's name instead of the character's name. He knows that Will Kemp is playing Dogberry, or he knows that Will Kemp is playing Lancelot Gobbo, and when he's writing it out, he puts Kemp instead of Gobbo or Dogberry. Now, we don't know this for sure because we don't have the manuscripts, but in many cases, these quartos were published from manuscripts. There are certain signs that tell us whether they come from manuscripts or prompt books, or whether they've been, as we say, memorially reconstructed by people who just heard the plays. And now you don't know this if you read a modern edition. Most people don't realize how reconstructed any modern edition of Shakespeare is. They've all been edited. No two are the same. Right. Try it sometimes, compare. Editors make different decisions. And so no one's going to leave Will Kemp in the margin for the character in a modern edition. They put in Dogberry, or they put in a Gobbo, or Falstaff. But again, these are signs that Shakespeare was working with the actors themselves. And all the evidence points to the fact that the person who wrote these plays was an active part of the theater world. And that's why it's very unlikely it's Francis Bacon. But again, it's amazing to see the contempt people in the 19th century have for actors. It's a kind of political correctness because even in the 19th century, as they did in Shakespeare's day, actors had a bad reputation. They were suspect, and so how could an actor have written these plays? As Charlton Heston, an actor, points out, it's precisely an actor that would have written these plays, and we have many examples of actor playwrights. Molière, France, would be another great example, but you just have to look at Sam Shepard in our day, Wallace Shawn, so many people who were actors go on to become playwrights or vice versa.
So let's close by saying a word this is very interesting about, so the political, like you mentioned, political correctness, some Victorian political correctness. Now we have identity politics, political correctness. That's really ultimately, in a funny way, what's behind the attempt to deny that Shakespeare is Shakespeare. I mean, different forms of...
in different periods, we have different forms of orthodoxy or political correctness, and we have a certain model of what an author should be, and Shakespeare doesn't fit that model.
And he's so great, I suppose, that if you have that model, you need to apply it to... If he exists independent of that orthodoxy, or contrary to that orthodoxy, it's a problem for the orthodoxy, right? If he can understand women as well as anyone has understood women and it isn't a woman, that's a problem for a certain kind of feminism. If he can understand aristocrats, that's a problem for a certain kind of Victorian. I guess that's why. I mean, that's why they're so intent on Shakespeare as opposed to other people.
I think that's a good point. That now again, Shakespeare is the greatest author who ever lived, certainly the greatest playwright, and so much greater than anybody else, that he's a real challenge. And it is miraculous that any one person could have written these plays. I like to say that if you create a list of the 20 greatest works of literature, Shakespeare wrote about 10 of them.
Right. And the range, and the English history, and Rome, and comedy, and tragedy.
It's extraordinary, and it simply cannot be explained. The joke of all this is people think they could explain it. If it could just be a guy who went to college, then he could have written the plays. Well, a lot of people went to college, they can't write Shakespeare. If he could just be an aristocrat, he could have written the plays. But in fact, there's no way to explain it. It's just one of the great miracles. And again, the Renaissance, produced Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, and they're not explainable either. So it is the miracle of human genius. But in Shakespeare's case, it is the real challenge that he just breaks all the categories. Johnson famously said in that prefatory poem to the first folio, was not of an age, but for all time.
Yeah.
And here we are still reading him. And it is miraculous. I mean, we talked about this when we were talking about canon formation in popular culture. I mean, Dante is incredibly great. Milton's incredibly great. But they're not read the way Shakespeare is, or performed. Well, they didn't write plays, but Dante, I guess in Italy, people still read him. But I don't think common people respond to Dante, and they certainly don't to John Milton. And there's so many cases like that. And Shakespeare transcends all the categories in this sense that he also is still popular, still the most popular playwright in the world, and that's incredibly frustrating. A lot of the people that challenge him, like Mark Twain, for example, wrote a whole book called Is Shakespeare Dead?, trying to prove that Shakespeare was Bacon. They're just jealous. They're just envious of Shakespeare. But this point with critics is, in the 19th century, you just have to look at someone like Matthew Arnold as a critic. He has such a middle-class view of the moral uprightness of literature. And so how could this guy from Stratford have written these plays that, after all, deal with adultery so much and all sorts of forms of criminality? But, by the way, Shakespeare should have been a criminal if he created Iago and all characters like that. So they want to remake Shakespeare in their Victorian image. And now, in our day, Shakespeare not only has to be a feminist, but he has to be a woman, because that's what they think is the epitome of human virtue, and just a refusal to accept the fact that he was able to do what he was because he simply was a genius and beyond categories. Now, I do think he was relatively learned, and increasingly think he read Aristotle, for example. Certainly he had read Machiavelli. And by the way, it's interesting, in some ways, I have no problem if someone other than William Shakespeare wrote these plays. I don't do biographical criticism. Right. I'm interested in what the plays express. I would have a problem with Bacon, because Bacon's philosophy is the absolute opposite of Shakespeare's. To put it in simple terms, I believe Shakespeare was an ancient and Bacon was a modern. And you see it on the issue of Machiavelli, that Bacon was a deep Machiavellian. And Shakespeare, though he had read Machiavelli and understood Machiavelli, he's ultimately anti-Machiavellian. And you can see that in the contrast of his Richard III and his Henry V, where Richard III is a pure Machiavellian and must be destroyed. Henry V is very Machiavellian, but ultimately knows to conceal that. And you could say he's the ultimate Machiavellian, but he does understand that you cannot simply pursue Machiavelli's low-minded view of human nature. Anyway, we could talk forever about this stuff that's actually in Shakespeare's plays, but I find it amusing that, with all due respect to Delia Bacon, that she thought that Bacon had written these plays. Aside from the fact he was so busy, I mean, he was writing volumes upon volumes of philosophy and history, and he was also Solicitor General, Attorney General, and a very active political career. That's the interesting thing, that there's something mysterious about Shakespeare in terms of his own greatness. And so people come forward with these alternatives, and yet they are far more problematic. In the case of the Earl of Oxford died in 1604. We can date Shakespeare's plays to 1610 or 11 and based on contemporary references. For example, Macbeth is based on, has references to the gunpowder plot in 1605. So how did the Earl of Oxford know the gunpowder plot against James versus Scott? Well, people say, well, he left these plays with instructions to add contemporary references to make them seem current. In all cases with these alternatives, and again, Bacon and Oxford are the most popular of the candidates, they require a lot more explanation than admitting that Shakespeare wrote them. They're constantly having to build up the equivalent of epicycles in astronomy to keep their theory going. And at some point, it's just have to say, no, Shakespeare wrote these plays.
Turns out it's harder to accept true genius and human excellence than to invent all these
yes,
all these workarounds, so to speak.
It's a good way of putting it.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope we've saved Shakespeare for Shakespeare, and now we can go back to having more conversations about Shakespeare. I'm looking forward to that. I'm very interested in the tragedy-comedy question, because the Shakespearean comedies are so close to being tragedies, and you can really see even some, I think, parallels in some cases between a tragedy and a comedy that he wrote, and he shows you that how easily a comic scene could have
Merchant
been.
of Venice is a
could
great
have
example of
been
that. Yeah, we
tragedy.
could do
So,
interesting conversation.
but we'll discuss them
comedies.
with the presumption that Shakespeare was Shakespeare.
Yes.
Paul Cantor, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for joining us on Conversations.